Hey there, welcome everybody. Let's see. So I'm super glad to be here today. Can we get my slides up? Awesome. Yeah, so as the title says, we're going to talk today about lessons we've learned creating educational VR games. Next slide. So some people, if you follow the space of educational and entertainment VR, you might be very aware in the entertainment space of a couple games that we've created. I Expect You to Die has been very, very successful. It's kind of an escape room game. And Until You Fall is our sword fighting game. So we spent a lot of time working on getting the entertainment side of virtual reality right. And for me, I've been working on virtual reality a long time. I started working on it in about 1992, worked at the Disney VR studio, then started teaching in Carnegie Mellon, teaching virtual reality classes. So I've been working on it pretty continuously. And so when VR started to become available for the home, I got pretty excited about it. And partly in terms of creating these sorts of entertainment products. But if you go to the next slide, also we've been doing educational VR, and really a lot of the entertainment we've been doing is sort of just a warm up to education because entertainment always precedes education. So we've worked on 4 different educational VR games so far, and so I thought I would today try to give you some lessons learned from these. So next slide. So a lot of people ask the question like, yeah, wait a second, you're talking about using VR for education. Is VR really ready? There's a lot of problems. Next slide there. One of the problems is the question of motion sickness. People bring this up. They say, oh, I can't do VR. I tried it once, it made me motion sick. Well, one of the things that is certainly true is it has a lot to do with the type of experience and the type of technology that you use. We're finding that we're at a place now where it's possible to create experiences that north of 99% of people have no problem at all with motion sickness. And so that's a problem that through good design is largely going away. So next slide. A lot of people say, wait a minute, these systems are so expensive that, that's thousands of dollars that we're potentially talking about. And some of them indeed are very, you know, his, historically, that's how they've been. But sorry, hang on one second there. However, if you go to the next slide, you can see that we have systems out now. The Oculus Quest, for example, I've got one right here in my hot little hands. There's no wiring, and the price is only $399 right now, and they might even go lower at some point soon. This system really is a system that's going to be mass market. You don't need a PC, you don't need a phone. Everything is just built into the system. You just put it on, you use it, and you go. These types of systems are the ones that are going to make a really big difference for education because they're just so easy to make use of. So next slide. Hygiene, though, is a real question. Certainly at this point in time, we're in the middle of a pandemic where people are afraid to get within 6 feet of each other for very good reasons. And the idea of a video game system where you rub your face all over it and then give it to someone else, that's kind of questionable. And it's problematic even in normal times. One of the things that is true is these systems that are for home, they're not quite as designed for sharing as what you're going to need if you're talking about any kind of school environment. So at some point, people are going to start to make systems that are much more school friendly. Right now, you have to use the solutions that are out there. If you go to the next slide, you'll see one of the common solutions, the Clean Box. This is relatively inexpensive. It's basically a box designed to mount your headset inside, and it's got a UV light, and within about 30 seconds to a minute, it does a really good job of disinfecting it. So these solutions are out there, and people are already finding ways in location-based entertainment, and they'll be finding ways for education to clean things as well. So next slide. So, but are the schools ready? Like, this is a really good question because we know that traditionally schools adopt technology slowly. So if you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to make VR experiences, I'm going to make them in schools, and I'm going to make a fortune doing that, you're going to find some challenges. Schools always adopt technology slowly for good reason. There's a lot of technology that isn't going to stay, right? And so schools have to experiment in bits and pieces. And that's what's happening now. We're kind of at the beginning phases where we're seeing schools starting to experiment. However, if you want to be in early, this is the time to go in. So if you're thinking about doing it, I've got 5 tips for you today. If you go to the next slide there. The first tip is you really want to focus on the body, right? People think about virtual reality as if it's a technology for the eyes, as if it's just some kind of 3D glasses. But that's not what virtual reality is at all. What virtual reality is a technology that brings your body into a computer simulation. And that's important because so much of our thinking and our action in the world is all about our bodies and how our bodies work. Go to the next slide. The most important thing is this feeling of presence. This is the thing that virtual reality does that other types of systems cannot do, is to create this feeling that you're actually in the world. And we see it happen all the time. People who are in the world and they'll go and they'll lean on a virtual table, and like they know intellectually it's not real, but their body forgets, because your body is sort of what decides what's real around you. You know, it sounds strange, but you have to embrace this notion if you're going to make successful VR experiences. So if you go to the next slide, talk about some of these here. So one of them that we worked on was HoloLab Champions. This is a virtual chemistry lab. If you go to the next slide, I'll show a video here to give you some sense of HoloLab and how it works.
Greatest event in the galaxy.
The traditional chemistry lab finally has a modern companion. Developed with input from chemistry teachers, HoloLab Champions is an immersive, safe, and entertaining environment that makes mastering lab skills fun. As game show contestants, players can perform a variety of lab challenges, leading to a show-stopping final lab. Or, in practice mode, they can hone their skills on specific tasks. Players are scored on accuracy and safety as they perform work that prepares them for success in a real lab. HoloLab Champions is the chemistry lab companion you've been waiting for.
Cool. So you get some sense of what HoloLab Champions is all about there. So the key thing, the reason we ended up making a chemistry lab experience that way is because we knew that chemistry is all about working with your hands. That's you have to build up muscle memory by actually working with your hands. I can't do that with a normal kind of simulation, so it's perfect for virtual reality. So you go to the next slide. So one way is working with your hands. Another way to embrace the body is to use the sense of the body's being in a place. I've heard many people who talked about visiting the Anne Frank house in real life and what a experience it was for them. But Matt Farber, who you might be hearing speak soon, he mentioned to me like, "Hey, have you tried this Anne Frank VR experience?" And indeed, it really is a powerful experience, and not because it brings you new information that you didn't know, but that sense of being in the place and in the space that she was in changes our body-mind relationship in some important way, and it can be very, very impactful. So when you're thinking about games that are really going to make an impact, you want to think about what are places where just being there really changes. Go to the next slide. And another thing to think about, the experience of being near someone. We have special nucleus inside our brain that is all about processing objects that are within arm's reach. Okay, so when someone comes near you and they like put their hand near your face, you really feel it, right? You can't do it with your own hand, but if someone else does, you really feel it because you're really processing that. I can't on a normal video give you any sense of that, but in VR, I can give you this sense of presence and everything that comes from it. A great experience was created at Carnegie Mellon. Was an experience called Injustice, which was a filmed VR experience all about the problems of police brutality. It puts you in situations where you're like right in the middle of things. You have to make decisions through conversation. So it's kind of you steer through conversation, actually using your voice in this space and place. And one thing that's fascinating about it is watching people do it. Even though the system has no hand tracking at all, people are constantly doing things with their hands because their body believes that they are in the place and the space. So the next slide. Another really important idea is the feeling of being someone else, right? Because that's one thing that VR lets you do. It lets you put yourself, put the guest into somebody else's shoes. Another great Carnegie Mellon experience was called Thin Line, which was all about a woman who had an unplanned pregnancy and had to have an abortion, and now it's the future, and she has to go and uh, deal with a medical condition. And the whole point of this experience is the fact that there is meaningful bias that often doctors and nurses show towards women who have had an abortion. And so this is an experience designed for doctors and nurses to try to see, here's what it's like to be a person with that medical history and to go into doctors' offices. And it's very well executed, very meaningful. It's so there's real possibility of kind of giving people um, real meaningful change in perspective by letting them be someone. So second tip on the next slide there is to make VR a creative tool. We often think of VR and video games as a way of just delivering content to somebody, or interacting in some goal-oriented way. But when you make it a creative tool, things change, right? One of the most powerful VR experiences, if you go to the next slide, is Tilt Brush. For people who are new to VR, if you haven't tried VR, I would really encourage you to try this as one of your first experiences. It lets you paint in 3 dimensions and walk all around and through the painting. And it's this sort of half painting, half sculpting. It's a very, very powerful experience. On the next slide, we were inspired to kind of create History Maker VR. We were looking at the question, how can we immerse people in history without having to spend millions of dollars building virtual cities or virtual battlefields or all the early things that people think about? We started wondering, what if we could just let you become these different figures? So if we go to the next slide, we'll see a little video, kind of show a trailer of how it works.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Welcome to today's Social Studies classroom, where the virtual reality content creation tool, History Maker VR, can enhance the learning experience. Students can immerse themselves in history while showing off their knowledge by embodying 8 diverse characters across U.S. history, from Ben Franklin to Sonia Sotomayor. It's easy to use. Students set up the scene and select their props, create their performance, import their script, and start recording. Export, edit, and share their performances with teachers and classmates.
Had great experiences testing it with both kids and teachers. And so there's your next slide. Designing for both teachers and students is a really important thing to do. Go to the next slide there. We did this with both experiences, with both HoloLab Champions and with History Maker. Because with HoloLab, we found the students, they were just interested in kind of playing with things in a way that they couldn't in real life. Even to the extent of like, what happens if what does it take to break something? Which sounds, maybe we shouldn't let the kids break things, but they should know like where those limits are. And so this gives you a safe place to play around with that. The teachers, on the other hand, were very interested in, let's make sure we have something that encourages the right kind of lab practice. So we ended up trying to design something that really worked for both. And same thing for History Maker. The history teacher is very interested in the idea of perspective taking, something very important to them, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of historical figures. The students, on the other hand, one of the things that students today are obsessed with is online videos. And a big part of what makes you culturally relevant and important as a teenager is your ability to create interesting YouTube videos. So we realized if we made this thing not just a toy, but a tool, a performance tool, to be able to let students create interesting videos that they would have a lot of interest in. And this is exactly what we've found when we've tried it out in the classroom. The idea that they can suddenly, in a lot of ways, this is sort of like a super filter where they can suddenly kind of create these really interesting videos that are both relevant to school and also possibly, just for fun. So next slide is my 4th tip, which is fulfill an educational fantasy. Everyone gets so focused on creating educational things on like how are we delivering the curriculum, and then sometimes people are focused on, well, is it the thing that's fun in the moment? But sometimes we forget about the idea of fantasy, because fantasy is what draws people in and gets people interested. And so then you have this question, well, what is an educational fantasy? And the thing about an educational fantasy is you have to think about not just what are we trying to teach, what are we trying to get across, but what are the things that people wish it was like, and how do they imagine it is? And that isn't always true, but often part of it is true. So on the next slide, you'll see we've got a little picture from Deep Time Detectives. So this was an experience we created for the Smithsonian institution. And the idea was this is a VR experience that a parent and a child can do together. Typically, child puts on the VR headset and the rest of the family is there, and they have a bigger screen with more information. Together, they work as a team. So if you take a look at this next video here,
look to your right. Pick up the red egg. Cover the mystery there. Well, this is a very fast brush. I've made of your life.
That's way better than the dinosaur museum.
Yeah, that's
Chisel this.
This looks like a dinosaur. This looks like a T-Rex.
So my partner is uncovering a mystery fossil. What kind of animal could it be?
so you'll see that this is a parent and child kind of working together. And this is an experience all about trying to identify a fossil. The person in VR can manipulate the fossils. The person out of VR has extra data, and together the two of them are going to classify the fossils. And that's the point of the exercise, is to classify fossils. Now, to do that, you don't need to brush off the dirt. We could just give you the fossils. But we know that the business of brushing off is such an important part of the fantasy of being a paleontologist. And of course, it worked really well in VR. We made sure to put it in there. And you saw that it drew them in, and you heard them talking about, oh, wow, this is so much better than the museum, right? Because because that's just part of the fantasy. And when you draw people into the fantasy, then they start to buy into, well, I really am a paleontologist. And then they start to want to act like a paleontologist, and they realize, I don't really know what it means to be a paleontologist. So anything you give them that like helps them act more like a real paleontologist, they'll start taking. But you got to draw them in with that fantasy first. And that brings me to my final tip, which is the idea of involving the spectators. Next slide. Yeah, involving the spectators is really important. If you see the next slide there's a game called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, which is a really fun game that's been a real success on VR. And you see and next slide there, guys. You'll see that there you go, one person is wearing a headset. Now that person is viewing what we see on the right, which is they're trying to defuse some kind of bomb, but they don't have enough information. And but the people outside, they have the information. So there's a lot of talk back and forth. Does it have a red wire? Does it have a blue wire? In order to figure out how to defuse this thing. And we saw that this was really fun. We used that as a real inspiration for our Smithsonian game. Next slide. And so let me show you what it's like when people collaborate together. The videos on the next
Closely related animals have bones with similar features. I told you to. Only. Oh, okay. We'll tell you where to search. Tell me where to search, Dad.
Back, hind leg.
Oh. Your fossil.
I don't even know what that means.
The partner is looking at an ankle bone diagram from the two animal groups. Describe your fossil and make sure to look at the red arrows. Discuss which of the two groups matches your fossil. We got seal dog group, whale deer group.
You want to do? You want to go?
I'm gonna do whale deer group because that looks like a deer.
Okay.
Like you see like the head features and the Hey.
Yeah, and so what's so powerful about that is they're solving a problem together, because that's how people want to interact. So if you have opportunities to kind of let spectators participate in VR, it often overcomes the isolation. So next slide. So you might be thinking still, okay, I don't know, this stuff is still so new. Do I really want to get into this? How many people are going to be able to do it right now? And on the next slide, you'll see another game where they had to ask themselves the same question. And that was the Oregon Trail. 1971, they started working on this game. Were they thinking, oh, this is going to be so much of a market right now. We should really build this because kids everywhere will be able to do it immediately. They absolutely were not able to do that. Instead, they were able to create something pioneering, and because they were there first, figuring it all out, 40 years later, this is still a game that we talk about, think about, and use as a meaningful reference and even play. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to make educational VR experiences that people are still talking about in 40 or 50 years, this might be the time. And I guess next slide, and thank you very much.